Hello, everybody. Our share today is entitled Rules for Writing a Sefer Torah, Rabbinic Innovation or Reflection of an Existing Scribal Tradition. For the share, I have drawn on the research of Professor Emmanuel Tov. He was the editor-in-chief of the Dead Sea Scrolls publication project. We're going to look at some of the halachas for writing a Sefer Torah, which we always understand as being particularly rabbinic, exclusively halachic. It's the way I always understood the laws of writing a Sefer Torah and tefillin and mezuzah. It's a uniquely rabbinic practice, tradition. But we're going to examine the rabbinic scribal tradition in relation to the relatively recent discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But we're going to see how the Dead Sea Scrolls changes the way we understand rabbinic scribal halacha, the laws of writing Sefer Torah and mezuzahs, etc. Now, the laws of writing a Sefer Torah are probably amongst the most detailed and revered of all the rabbinic laws. We all know this. Every letter, every margin, every column is governed and prescribed by laws and by precision. And it creates the impression of a system that was completely devised, wholly devised by the rabbis. Uniquely Jewish, uniquely rabbinic, something that you don't find elsewhere. Such focus on detail you don't find in other scribal traditions. And this was designed, we understand, by the rabbis, particularly of the Tannaic period, when all Jewish law was formulated from the 1st century CE. These laws were formulated in order to safeguard the sanctity and the accuracy of Jewish texts, of religious texts. But the Dead Sea Scrolls discoveries have changed our perception and have complicated this picture. And this is what we're going to look at today. Because the Dead Sea Scrolls echo scribal traditions that were common centuries before. Now, this becomes interesting. Straight away, this becomes absolutely fascinating. Because until now, we thought that the Mishnaic rabbis innovated to a large extent. Obviously, they didn't suck it out of their thumbs. They took it from somewhere, but largely it was an innovation. It was a reworking of earlier traditions. But the Dead Sea Scrolls show that there were other traditions as well. And sometimes these traditions seem to overlap our traditions, the rabbinic traditions, but sometimes they didn't. So with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, what previously seemed like a unique rabbinic innovation in our laws of writing Sefer Torah, it now appears that, at least in part, what the rabbis simply did was they codified existing traditions. I say that again, they codified existing traditions. They took existing traditions from elsewhere. We'll explore some of this in a moment. But they took existing scribal traditions, scribal practices, centuries old, maybe even older, and they now codified these almost in a form of acculturation. Now, that word acculturation is very interesting because the way you define acculturation, it's not like assimilation. Assimilation, obviously, is where you live in a culture and you become assimilated to that culture. So you simply imbibe whatever you see in that culture. But acculturation is something very different. It's adapting to, according to the definition, or one definition is it's adapting to dominant cultural influences without compromising essential distinctiveness. In other words, you remain the same. But see, today, Jews who live in various parts of the world have become acculturized. Americans have got a distinctly American Jewish culture. Israelis have a different culture, but they can all be religious. They can all be Jews, but they very, very different, because where you live has an influence on how you think and how you behave to a very large extent. And that is known as acculturation. It's very different from assimilation. You don't have to be assimilated to be acculturated. But it seems as if our Jewish scribal tradition was developed through a form of acculturation, not assimilation, but acculturation. We took things, in the first century, the rabbis took things that were dominant in the societies in which they lived, and they codified them and turned them into halakha. But they may not have been absolutely, completely, and always distinctly Jewish. They certainly weren't always distinctly rabbinic, because the rabbinic period has a beginning. 10 CE is when the rabbinic period, the Tanaic period, officially begins. So this now sheds a completely different light on the notion of the laws of this Jewish scribal laws, the laws of writing Torah, Tefillin, and mezuzahs. It may not be as uniquely Jewish, certainly not uniquely rabbinic, as we may previously have thought. But the interesting thing is that the dominant cultural traditions that the rabbis would have been exposed to in the aftermath of the fall of the Second Temple, which is round about the time, a little bit after the Tanaic period began, those traditions would have been prevalent within the various Judean sects living in various parts of the desert. And those traditions, those scribal traditions, were anything but consistent. And that's where the rabbis came in, because they made it consistent. They took from this variety of choice in the scrolls that had been dominant in the era just before the rabbinic period. They codified them, they unified them, and now they were clearly rabbinic. So they certainly did become rabbinic. We also need to understand that according to the rabbinic tradition, the laws of writing a Sefer Torah have always been understood in terms of being an unbroken chain of transmission going back all the way to Mount Sinai. It's like this with so many things. Nothing ever changes. Nothing's changed. Sinai and even before, everybody always did exactly what we do now in exactly the same way. And this too applied to the laws, to the way the scribal laws were generally understood, that our scribal laws go back to Mount Sinai. There was no change. There was no evolution. There was no development along the way. All those halachas that you find in Shulchan Aruch were essentially given at Mount Sinai. And there was this unbroken chain of transmission. This is the traditional view, the way that we generally understand this. But when one goes into the history, one finds that the ancient practices had an influence on the development of Jewish scribal laws, halachic scribal laws. So the Dead Sea Scrolls offer us a historical critical means or lens to view the development of Jewish scribal laws, because they were very much based on those Dead Sea Scroll traditions. And as I mentioned, those Dead Sea Scrolls were produced in the time of the Second Temple, around about from the 3rd century, even earlier, Generally, the dates are given that the Dead Sea Scrolls reflect the culture of the various Jewish groups, the culture of those groups from about 300 BCE to 100 CE. So that's about a 400 odd year period that those Dead Sea Scrolls um, um, were written. The interesting thing that the Dead Sea Scrolls do is that they offer us something that we never ever had before. Until they were discovered. They were discovered in 1947. Right? There's about 1,000, or there are thousands of fragments of about 900 basic texts. So it's a very large body of literature, reflecting about a 400 years, even earlier, even more period of Jewish writings. But until they were discovered, the earliest Torah scroll, or the earliest Masoretic, in other words, rabbinic Torah text that we had, was the Aleppo Codex, which was produced in the 10th century. We've dealt with this before in previous talks, written by Ben Asher, who may have been and seems to have been a Karaite, interestingly enough. And that scroll was produced in Tiberias around about the 10th century. And it was actually housed in the Karaite shul in Jerusalem. So the great irony is that the rabbinic text, the most accurate rabbinic text, the Masoretic text, the Masorah text for the rabbis, was produced by a Karaite Jew and remained within Karaite possession until the Crusades came. They ransacked the shul, the Karaite shul in Jerusalem, where this text was held for many centuries, and it was taken by the Christian Crusades and ransomed, or they were going to try and ransom it in Jewish communities. And when they arrived in Egypt, the Jewish community in Egypt paid a tremendous price for this great text because it was the most accurate Torah text. The Rambam eventually sees it, Maimonides sees it, he authorizes it, and he writes that this is the text that he endorses, this is the text that he uses. So how did it get known? How did it become known as the Aleppo Codex? Well, 5 generations after Rambam, his children and grandchildren became the leaders of Egyptian Jewry, the Nagidim. They were the leaders of Jews in Egypt. Interestingly, as we mentioned before, they were Jewish Sufis, which sounds very strange, but they represented a mystical school of Jewish Sufism. In fact, most of the Egyptian Jews practiced a kind of Jewish Sufism, which is rather ironic, the descendants of the rationalist Rambam. But this all started with Avram ben Arambam, who became a mystic, whereas Rambam himself, the father, was a great rationalist. But after 5 generations, they moved from Egypt and they went to live in Aleppo, and they took the scroll with them. And that scroll remained in Aleppo until actually around about the time that the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. Remained there till 1948, and then there's a whole story of the whole saga of the Aleppo Codex. What happened? Was it burnt? Was it not burnt? Was it? It's something that we've dealt with before, but that's how it became known as the Aleppo Codex. But essentially, this was the oldest scroll that we knew, and it became the authoritative rabbinic scroll, which we now refer to as the Aleppo Codex, but that's from the 10th century. Another scroll was the Leningrad Codex, which a lot of our Sefer Torah, our Chumashim are based on, about 100 years later, the Leningrad Codex. But those were the 2 oldest codexes. The Dead Sea Scrolls, however, changed that as well. Dead Sea Scrolls, we don't often speak about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we should, because it changes so much of our history. The Dead Sea Scrolls produced texts that were 1,000 years earlier than what later became known as the Aleppo Codex. So now we had access to, so we only had evidence of our oldest evidence had now been extended by 1,000 years with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's extremely significant discovery in the scrolls. But going back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're anything but conventional. There's a large range of stylistic conventions that you find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was nothing like what later became the rabbinic tradition. Because people often say, you take a Sefer Torah, you compare it to a Torah in Russia, a Torah in Egypt, they're all exactly the same. Well, of course they're the same, because once they became standardized, and especially once they became printed, they're obviously going to be the same. It depends how far you go back. The further you go back, you start finding some discrepancies. But the Dead Sea Scrolls were full of discrepancies. Some of them actually conform very much to the Masoretic tradition, which is interesting, but many of them do not. And they reflect, interestingly enough, the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation, and the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Samaritan Chumash, which is interesting because it just shows that there were so many different traditions at that time. Now we have the Torah. It's one particular version. But had you lived in Second Temple periods, there was quite a range and quite a variety. So we can understand with this little background, we can understand that the rabbinic authorities were now responding to this tremendous plurality in text. And you don't want to have a plurality in Jewish texts because it just complicates matters. We want a unified text. So this is why the rabbis set out, especially at the beginning of the Tanaic period, especially after the fall of Jerusalem, to create this sense of unity, to create the sense that there is only one text. And our impression then has become, I'm not saying that the rabbis intended, but our impression then became that this was the same text that remained exactly the same. And there was no change whatsoever. There was this continuity going back all the way to Sinai. But this Dead Sea Scrolls highlight that there was an adaptation and adoption of all sorts of different variances in the text. And the rabbis responded to lived realities. They saw the text. They knew the texts. They didn't have to discover it like we discovered it in 1947. They were aware of it. They'd obviously studied from those texts, and they saw the variances. So they decided that it was important to unify and to create halacha regarding a scribal tradition for rabbis, for Jews. So, in a sense, the Dead Sea Scrolls offers us something good and offers us something that might not be so good. What's good is that it shows that the evidence of Torah texts, the empirical evidence of Torah texts, goes back 1,000 years than before. So after 1947, we now had proof that the Torah, as we have it, was 1,000 years older than we thought before. Remember, starting with the Aleppo Codex. But it also offers challenges or makes the study of Jewish scribal law rather interesting in terms of its development. We also need to add that the scribal traditions that were available to the rabbis in the time of the Masorah may not only have been from the Jewish sects around the Judean desert, but they may have come from general scribal traditions as well, which means that those early rabbis may have been exposed even to non-Jewish styles of writing, as well as different styles of Jewish sects, which just complicates the picture even more. So they had this very broad canvas from which to work on in order to formulate and now codify for the first time one set of accurate laws for writing Sifrei Torah. And once again, this fits into the needs of the milieu. The temple had just been destroyed. The Jews were scattered. One thing they needed was unity. And this is part of the Mishnah project that is often neglected. The rabbis, the Mishnah rabbis, the Tanaim, had to create unity. By hook or by crook, they had to create unity to keep the people together at the beginning of what turned out to be a very long exile. So the codification of the scribal laws was just part of that general project to create unity. And also something that we mention very often, but should not be just passed over, also to create authority. If the rabbis are not able to create the authority, sometimes it's been referred to as the tyranny of the rabbinate, but I don't know if we always want to go that far, but if the rabbis weren't able to create authority, they would never get far in this project of creating unity. we'd continue with the diversity of Second Temple period. Remember, the rabbinic group is a new group. These are the group of the Perushim, or the Pharisees, whereas the leadership beforehand in the time of the temple were the Tzadokim, sometimes referred to as the Tzedukim, but they came from the family of Tzadok. And this was a dominant priestly family. The high priest was always from the family of Tzadok. So it was a very different group, a very different sect of Jews that now takes over at the time of the Tanaim, a very different group. So the reins of authority had transferred from the tribal sect, from the priestly sect, to the so-called rabbinic sect. So these are important changes. These are things that we need to be aware of. So now the scribal laws became binding. This was the great innovation of the Tanaim. They became binding. It became halacha. You could not write a Sefer Torah. Your Sefer Torah would not be kosher anymore if you didn't follow the guidelines. Whereas before you had all sorts of different variants. Now, the laws were strict. Your mezuzah wasn't kosher. Your tefillin wasn't kosher. Your Torah wasn't kosher unless you followed the prescriptions, the very, very intense and precise prescriptions required by the rabbis. And there was a central authority, and this is exactly the project of the rabbis in the period after the destruction of the Second Temple. So, Emmanuel Tov points out something rather interesting. And this is what I find a great irony, but a fascinating irony. We look at the laws of writing a Sefer Torah, and we get the impression, A, that they've always been there, exactly as they are, and B, that they are particularly and intrinsically holy, which they are, because of course the Sefer Torah is the holiest item, and the mezuzahs and tefillin, of course, are holy. But according to Emmanuel Tov, there's very little of the rabbinic scribal tradition that is actually rabbinic. I'll say that again. Very little of the rabbinic tradition is rabbinic. It's Tanaic, because of everything that we've said. They took from previous traditions before the Tanaim, and those traditions were, some of them were interesting, some of them may have even been questionable, some of them may not have even been all that Jewish, or all that halachic. If halacha existed in the way that it existed in after the time before the time of the Amoraim. So Tov writes, and I quote, he says, most details mentioned in the Mishnah and the Talmudim, and it's a fact in the Mishnah and the Talmudim, even before the Shulchan Aruch, the details of writing a Sefer Torah that are found in the Mishnah and the Gemara are known from the Dead Sea Scrolls. In other words, they were not rabbinic. They were taken from the scrolls, from the sects, from the various groups of Jews who lived. And some were more halachic, some were less halachic, some were ascetics. They were all different groups. When the Jewish world was notoriously full of these various people, starting their own communities all over the Judean desert at that time. So the tradition, our scribal tradition, is actually not rabbinic. It's not a rabbinic tradition. And it reflects the tradition of bookmaking, says Tov, as reflected by the rabbis, which simply represents the realia of the earlier periods, unquote. So all the rabbis did is they codified existing reality that they saw in texts, which means if you rephrase it, it's not uniquely rabbinic. So what we think is intrinsically holy and absolutely special is not uniquely rabbinic. It's not rabbinic. It was codified by the rabbis, become extremely rabbinic, but they were drawing on obviously non-rabbinic sources. I'm not saying that they contradicted what later became rabbinic sources, because we mentioned that there was often overlap with what later became known as the Masoretic texts. But essentially, their body on which they drew was not rabbinic. what they did was they codified scribal reality, cultural reality. They codified. In a sense, you could say, well, then it became holy because they codified it. Fine. That's absolutely correct. But that's just semantics. What they did was they formulated halacha, which simply represented, and again, I quote from Tov, the average scribe of a Dead Sea Scroll. That's how he puts it rather bluntly. They took like a set of averages from the average, from what we see from our Dead Sea Scrolls today. They took an average of the average writing style of an average Dead Sea Scroll scribe, who may have been orthodoxy didn't exist yet, but they may have been, they may not have been. Some of them may not have been all that Jewish even. They may have been general scribal practices as well. So they took an average of those texts that reality presented to them, general scribal traditions that you would find in other cultures. Other cultures were also writing texts. And what they did is they extracted what they needed to extract and they codified it. And then it became binding, then it became holy, and then it became a Jewish tradition. But it's interesting to see that from a historical critical point of view, it's very difficult to simply say that we just took text, we just took these things all the way back from Sinai without any changes whatsoever, because the historical record doesn't show that. So this leads now to the striking conclusion that the complex writing protocols that we have, I mean, you can open up books on how to write a Sefer Torah, you can go on a course to learn how to be a sofer. It's wonderful, and the laws are complicated, very, very complicated. But these complex writing protocols were not inherently holy, because they weren't necessarily taken from holy sources. They were taken from the average scribe of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So to quote Tov, and we're drawing near to our conclusion, to quote Emmanuel Tov, he says, I always like to quote when I'd rather have someone else say things. There is no quote, there is nothing sacred about the procedures described in rabbinic literature regarding writing a Sefer Torah. There's nothing sacred about the procedures. But due to the strictness of the rules, so when you look at the rules, it's so strict and it's so formal, the impression is created that these prescriptions were invented exclusively for preparing scripture scrolls, tefillin, and mezuzot. You cannot help, unquote, you cannot help but, after looking at the intricacies and the minutiae of Jewish scribal law, you cannot but think that these are homegrown rabbinic teachings reflecting an ancient rabbinic tradition, because that's the way that it's presented. But Tov describes it completely differently, that this was simply a reflection of lived experience, of lived realia, of lived scribal traditions that were available at that time. The Dead Sea Scrolls again go on to quote. See, and we only know this in the last 80 years. This is what's so astonishing about what we're speaking about today. We couldn't have spoken about this 80 years ago, 85 years ago. We couldn't have spoken about this because we wouldn't have known about these traditions. So we would have once again been locked in that belief system that these are unique Jewish laws, unique laws about writing a Sefer Torah regarding spacing and letters. In fact, let me just read you some of these ideas of spacing that we see, just to give you an idea of the intricacies. And these are all taken from sources in the Gemara and in the Mishnah, the Talmud and the Rishonim. So just again showing how these laws are presented as being uniquely rabbinic and uniquely Jewish and holy and not reflecting external cultures whatsoever. So the Mishnah tells us that a scroll has to be covered by a mitpachat or a mappa, some kind of a cover. You know, our Torah scrolls have a cover. So You don't just have a scroll. It must be protected by a cover. The rabbis describe how you make ink, how you compose the ink. You don't just take ink, Indian ink. There's intricate laws regarding how you make ink for writing Sefer Torah. The letters have to be Assyrian, which is interesting, not ancient Hebrew, Assyrian, which is another very interesting thing. That's the square letters that we use today, and the Sefer Torah has got those very square letters, the Assyrian square script. The Talmud Yerushalmi tells us that the scrolls can only be written in Hebrew. Actually, some hold that a Sefer Torah written in Greek, not just ordinary Greek that you speak today, but in ancient Greek, can be Torah, can be kosher. So you can have a kosher Torah written in ancient Greek. That script is also okay, which is interesting because it connects with the idea of drawing on earlier scribal traditions. And that's brought down even in halacha. We know that you can't have damaged letters. Everybody knows if you're reading in a Torah in the shul and you come across a letter that looks like it's faded or cracked, you call a child up, a young child who can just barely read, and you say, is that a vav or a resh? And if the child says it's a vav, they say, okay, it's a vav, it's kosher, and you carry on reading. And we've got all these intricate laws, again, that seem uniquely holy, uniquely Jewish. According to the Talmud Yerushalmi, however, the Yerushalmi is always a little bit more open than the Talmud Bavli, as we've dealt with many times before. The Talmud Yerushalmi tells us that Torah scrolls may have a frequency of mistakes, okay, because everyone thinks, if there's one mistake, you're going to put the Torah away, and if you don't correct it within 30 days, you've got to bury it. According to Yerushalmi, it's not the case. You can have a frequency of 2 or 3 mistakes per column. That means in every column in the Sefer Torah, you can have up to 3 mistakes, and the Torah is still kosher. According to the Yerushalmi. According to Bavli, you can't have 1 mistake in the entire Torah. But again, I'm just showing that there's a variety of interesting laws. The Gemara in the Bavli in Menachos, Tes Amud Aleph, tells us that you can't even have, that's in the Bavli, that you can't have a single mistake. But the Yerushalmi says there's a frequency of mistakes. So if you work out how many columns there are in a Sefer Torah, and you give each column 3 mistakes, you can have quite a lot of mistakes in your Sefer Torah for it still to be considered kosher. And the Rambam also paskins that if there are certain mistakes in the Torah can still be kosher. The Gemara also tells us that the lines in the Sefer Torah have to be drawn with a reed. How does the scribe write the letters in a straight line? So if you look carefully at the Sefer Torah, if you hold it up to the light a little bit, not writing in 2 lines, like children write in school books today, if they still write, but there's 1 line at the top, because the Hebrew letters have got a long flat line, not at the base of the letter, but at the top of the letter. So most of the Hebrew letters would fit in nicely if you've got a line at the top. So they use the line at the top that's drawn with a reed. It's not drawn with any kind of ink. It's not penciled in. It's an impression that's made by a sharpened reed in the parchment, and that's how we get the straight line, and the letters are formed based on that, but they form from the top down. All right, so that's also a prescription. The stitching of a Sefer Torah, you have to stitch with sinew, so you can't just go to the haberdashery and buy cotton. You've got to use sinews from certain animals. The spacing, there's a lot of space that's spent on spacing in halacha. You have to have the width of a line between lines, although I've seen some Torahs that don't really stick to that, but that's the one source says that you have to have the width of a letter between the words. So if you've got one word, another word, the space between 2 words has to be the width of an average letter. There must be some space between letters so the letters can't touch. I don't know exactly what the prescription is, but the way I understand it, there must be some space. You must be able to see some white space between the letters, and a thumb's width between columns. And then there must be 4 lines between each of the 5 books of the Torah in the scroll. So four lines. So that's why there's that gap about this long, 4 lines between each book. So between Bereshit and Shemot, etc., you would have 4 lines. The Torah scroll must have 2 bars to protect the scrolls, 2 wooden bars or two rods on either side. But the books of the Nevi'im, of the prophets, only need to have 1 bar on the one side at the end. of the scroll. So that's just like a brief overview of some of these halachas. But again, this emphasizes the point that we think that these are uniquely rabbinic laws that were produced by Jews for Jews and have always been there, and they're intrinsically holy. But according to the research by Professor Manuel Tov, they simply reflect a very well-known and variated general scribal tradition. They included Jews and general cultures as well. But we only know this in the last 80 years. This is what the Dead Sea Scrolls have taught us. So they've offered us something very good. Torah is 1,000 years older. Evidence is 1,000 years older than we thought. But it also offers us some challenges because it complicates the picture of Jewish scribal law. To conclude with a quote again from Emmanuel Tov, he says, had the Dead Sea Scrolls not been found by accident in Qumran, if they hadn't been found, we may have considered many of the instructions of rabbinic literature to be the brainchildren of the rabbis. So we would have continued to believe that these are uniquely Jewish laws. The rabbis, the Tanaim, codified them or wrote about them. They're codified by later halacha. But these are unique rabbinic laws, emphasizing the sanctity and, in fact, causing the sanctity of the texts. Without these laws, the sanctity is lost. So you lose the sanctity if you don't have these laws. This is what we would have thought. This was that these laws were the brainchildren, in Tov's words, of the rabbis. However, we now know better. We now know that that's not the case. So, the Dead Sea Scrolls have severely endorsed the authenticity of the Masoretic texts, but it has also challenged some of our preconceptions of Jewish scribal laws, the halachas of writing, Sifrei Torah, mezuzahs, and tefillin. With the Dead Sea Scrolls, what was once a unique, what we once thought was a unique rabbinic innovation or tradition, now emerges as simply a project of standardization. That's all they did. They standardized an existing tradition. They Judaized a standing general scribal tradition. That's what they did. They're not uniquely Jewish laws. All scribal traditions have got these cultures, how you write a scribe, how you write the text, or they also deal with spacing. They do with similar things, standardization of a text. Just like you want to print a book today, there's a margin, there's a paragraph. These practices are standard writing practices. Many of these were incorporated by the rabbis, but they were not invented, and they don't reflect necessarily they don't always necessarily reflect an ancient rabbinic or Jewish idea. It was a project of standardization, essentially. Standardization, harmification, also authority, creating authority when it comes to the rabbinic class, which is part of the rabbinic project in the aftermath of the destruction of the Second Temple. But the Dead Sea Scrolls were a turning point in our understanding of Jewish scribal laws, which is really interesting, allowing us to see rabbinic scribal laws not just as isolated rabbinic innovations, again, with the claim that it goes back all the way to Mount Sinai, absolutely unchanged, but we see them now within the broader continuum of Jewish and also general scribal culture. So that, in a nutshell, is everything that we've discussed. It's a standardization process, allowing us to look at these halachas within this broader continuum of scribal traditions, some Jewish, some perhaps not. So the rabbis were then both heirs and also reformers of scribal traditions, because they changed some things as well. But they also kept some of the earlier traditions, and who knows how far back they may have gone. But they were heirs and they were reformers in their program of codification and unification. And they did this all in the service, says Tov, of communal cohesion and rabbinic authority, which is exactly what the Jews needed in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Second Temple. And as a result of them doing things like this, codifying Jewish law, writing the Mishnah, they were able to preserve and to some degree create the Judaism that we have today. I thank you so much for listening and look forward to seeing you next time.